You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to episode 41 of A Life in Ruins podcast, where we investigate the careers of those living a life in ruins. I'm your host, Carlton Gover, and I am joined by my co-hosts, Connor Johnen and David Ian Howe. In this episode, we are pleased to have both Lana Ruck and Ella Beaudoin back on our show. Ella was on episode 2, and Lana was on episode 16. Since episode 37, Settlers of Cerutti with Dr. Shane Miller and Dr. Jesse Toon was such a hit, we wanted to have Ella and Lana return to the show to talk about some controversial topics within paleoanthropology. Lana and Ella, thank you guys so much for agreeing to come back. How are you ladies doing this evening?
We're doing great. Well, I can only speak for myself, but I'm doing great.
Yeah, we're doing well. Today is impeachment day number 2, second impeachment of Donald Trump, so I'm in a better mood than I have been for the past few days.
We've had first impeachment, yes. What about the second impeachment?
Yeah.
Excellent. So that is what's going on in the contemporary United States right now. But just wanted to kick us back off with brief reintroductions about yourself. And Ella, why don't you go first? What have you been up to since we last had you on so long ago?
Well, that is a great question. Obviously, the pandemic hit, so not a lot of in-the-field stuff has been going on. I talked to you guys right before I went into the field in 2019, I think. And that was a really fun experience. I was working more with the community of people up in and around Lake Turkana. Yeah, and other than that, just making memes and hanging out in the Human Origins Department at the Smithsonian. Other than that, really not very much, to be honest. A lot of knitting other than that.
Yeah, if you guys don't follow her on social media, she makes some fantastic clothing and is selling it currently. So please go check it out. I'm excited. Is your next one going to be a Bigfoot one? Is that something you're willing to admit?
Yeah, the next insane sweater I'm making is this huge, shag Bigfoot that I bit off more than I can chew in creating. So we'll see how I'll figure that one out. But it's quite fun.
Yeah, it's at Simple Homo Sapien. Is that the place to find you at?
Yes, Simple Homo Sapien is my Instagram, and then at Ella_Beaudoin is my Twitter. Yeah.
Heck yeah. Lana, how are things going for you amid the pandemic and since we last talked to you?
It's also been pretty slow. So I'm still a PhD candidate at IU Bloomington. I haven't been able to collect my dissertation data because it's with human participants and it is not safe to do so. So I've been teaching quite a bit, and I knit one really shitty hat because I tried to pick up knitting and it didn't really succeed for me. So I do love seeing successful knitters making amazing things, but I have made one hat and that's what I've been up to.
Incredible. The life of archaeologists when we're stuck at home.
Yeah, I guess technically I've played hundreds of hours of Nintendo Switch. So that has taken over my life of
hobbiness. I think that counts.
Excellent. So just a brief explanation for why we're having Ella and Lana on the show tonight to talk about controversial topics within paleoanthropology is that both Ella and Lana, if you haven't listened to their episodes before, work at very famous paleoanthropological sites in Africa. So Ella cut her teeth at Kubi Fora, whereas Lana earned her stripes at Olduvai Gorge. And like I said, both of these site complexes have produced some of the most groundbreaking discoveries in our understanding of human evolution. And something that we want to talk about is kind of this trope outside of paleoanthropology that people, when they talk about paleoanthropology, is that the discipline of human evolution has these cult of personalities. So I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about with you guys and what you guys think about that trope that the rest of us have about what goes on in paleoanthropology.
Yeah, of course. I feel like if you don't mind, I'll jump in here. I feel like paleoanthropology, at least in my experience, more than any other archaeological sub-discipline, has these people who most of their research is so driven by who they are and the kind of people that they are. And I feel like we can, obviously it didn't necessarily start with the Leakeys, but the Leakeys are a great example of these cult figures in paleoanthropology who have some of the most discoveries, but then also had very interesting personality types. I feel like Mary Leakey has a lot of very interesting stories about her and how she would act at field sites. And I remember one, I don't even know is true, that she shot a windmill once with a rifle. That kind of vibe of person, I feel like is pretty common in paleo.
Yeah, we have an old Mary Leakey cigar butt that is just hanging in an artifact bag in one of the labs, just like an artifact of Mary Leakey, you know?
That's incredible.
It is. I would also agree with that there's just a certain amount of like ballsiness and animatedness that comes with a lot of the premier scientists in this field. And it's good because it gets the field a lot of attention and people learn about what's going on with the fossil discoveries and stuff. But it is also kind of people are always trying to find the next oldest thing or going to find something older than you. And time will tell who's going to win this race that is totally arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a blessing and a curse.
Totally. There's a really good video by John Marks. It's like 5 minutes long on YouTube, and it was recorded after one of the biological anthropology meetings where he talks about like how the study of humanity itself kind of breeds this obsession that we don't have, for instance, about fruit flies or, frogs or physics or things like that. So I would recommend that for anybody interested. It's like you could probably just YouTube John Marks Human Evolution or something.
Yeah. And I think also what's interesting about the kind of what happens when we have these cult personalities is just the fact of the fights that happen and the controversies within our discipline is very interesting. I mean, I feel like a lot of people have been watching Bridgerton on Netflix, and there's one character, like I can't remember most of it, but there was one character who like writes these scandalous letters about the drama going on in the society at the time. And I feel like a lot of the replies to different articles in paleo are very similar. Like they're very snarky, a lot of these different replies to one another. And it's quite entertaining.
Yeah, agreed.
I was going to ask you, do you think it's because this kind of cult personality and the intenseness of the arguments you guys have in paleoanth is because the world is kind of paying attention to this stuff? Because I don't feel in like most archaeology fields that like people are like paying attention to, this is the oldest plain site or, something like that. But I think these names like the Leakeys and things like that, they get propelled to like national news, Lee Berger and things like that. Do you think that's kind of part of it, is that you guys are like discovering our origins, and then you guys, the paleoanth community kind of gets put into that larger sphere?
I think it's kind of complicated in that I think people have realized one of the ways to get money and get funding for sites can be through being the person who finds the things. You know what I mean? It's not just about the science. It is about who you are as a person and finding funders in that way. And I think that paleoanthropology has a pretty good, obviously, you still apply to NSF and you get like completely merit-based grants. But I think at the same time, there is a world where when people pay more attention to you and therefore your discoveries, you do have a tendency to get more money, more funding, more resources to go find more. And at least that's kind of my perception of it. I also think, like Lana said, like human evolution, everyone feels as though they have an equal stake in it, even though that might not necessarily be the case, right? Because we obviously have people who actively live by sites, but I can feel as quote unquote connected to our human origins as someone across the world, right? Because it's our human origins. So I do feel like, just like you said, Lana, it's a connector for a lot of people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really like that you brought up the funding angle. And I think I'm also really glad that Connor brought up that it's more plugged into the media cycle in terms of like Scientific American coverage or Nature or Discovery or National Geographic writing more about like paleoanthropology topics more often than other archaeology or anthropology. And in terms of like the content, like the cult of personality like definitely drives maybe the temperature of the narrative, if that's a good phrase. But the actual content itself, when you're working with really limited samples and they're really difficult to find because preservation is such that, you might only have, like at Olduvai, the entire history there are only 80 hominin fossils. And so everybody says, don't go to Olduvai if you want to find a hominin, go there for stone tools. But like the amount of effort that you have to put into discovering the finds, and the fact that there isn't a lot of available data to like mitigate arguments about how to interpret things, right? Like our sample sizes really are at the end of the day quite limited, which opens it up for principled debate. And also all the flavors that come on top of that, actually scientifically principled debate about what is the significance of this find or interpretation or stuff like that.
Truly an incredible point.
Yeah. So it's a perfect storm. It's totally a perfect storm. And I enjoy that part of the field. But being in my other discipline where things are a little bit less heated, I also enjoy that. So.
Yeah, of course. I do feel like I fit into, as much as I kind of say that with a little bit of self-deprecation as well, I do feel like I fit in quite a lot with a lot of paleo people in a way that probably isn't great, but it's just that, loud, adventurous in a way that's incredibly fun and very energizing group of people, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think I have at times, I'm just like, I totally have some of the like what we would say is like negative attributes of some of the really, really, really high profile famous people. Like I'm a little bit self-obsessed with my career and I'm a little bit narcissistic, and all of us are kind of like that.
Well, truly, we are all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of solving the problem is saying it out loud. So yeah, but it's a really fun field to be a part of. And it's really exciting when new things happen and when you try and hash them out and figure them out and make new other discoveries along the way.
And speaking of new discoveries and trying to figure them out, let's get into tonight's topic, which is the Lomekwi. Did I say that right? Lana was yelling at me earlier. The Lomekwi 2 and the Lomekwi tools, which came out in a Nature article not too long ago. So let's go ahead. We'll give you guys a brief intro to what we're talking about tonight.
I hate you.
Take it away, David.
Why? Oh my God. I'm down. Okay, guys, if you've listened to the show or followed me, you know I'm illiterate, so just bear with me. Lomekwi 3 is the name of an archaeological site in Kenya where ancient stone tools have been discovered, dating to 3.3 million years ago, which makes them the oldest ever found. In July 2011, a team of archaeologists led by Sonia Harmond and Jason Lewis of Stony Brook University, United States, shout out Long Island, were heading to a site near Kenya's Lake Turkana near Kenyanthropus platyops fossils had previously been found. The group made a wrong turn on the way and ended up at a previously unexplored region and decided to do some surveying. They quickly found some stone artifacts on the site, which they named Lomekwi 3. A year later, they returned to the site for a full excavation. Harmon presented her findings at the annual meeting of the Paleoanthropology Society on April 14th, 2015, and published the full announcement and results on the cover of Nature on May 21st, 2015.
Around 20 well-preserved artifacts have been dug up at Lomekwi 3, including anvils, cores, and flakes. An additional 130 artifacts were found on or near the surface. In one instance, Harmon's team was able to match a flake to its core, suggesting that a hominin had made and discarded the tool at the site. The tools were generally quite large, larger than the oldest known stone tools recovered in the Gona area of the Afar region of Ethiopia in 1992. The largest weighs 15 kilograms and may have been used as an anvil. According to Harmond, it appeared that the tool makers had purposely selected large, heavy blocks of strong stone, ignoring smaller blocks of the same material found in the area. She ruled out the possibility that the stone tools were actually natural rock formations, saying the artifacts were clearly knapped and not the result of accidental fracture of rocks. Analysis suggested the cores had been rotated as flakes were struck off. The purpose of the tools found at Lomekwi 3 is unclear, as animal bones found at the site do not bear any sign of hominin activity. This is the greatest expression of the late Negocene technology in human evolutionary history. based on the artifact's stratigraphic position in undisturbed sediment relative to 2 layers of volcanic ash and no known magnetic reversals, Harmond and her team dated the tools to 3.3 million years ago. The finds at Lomekwi therefore represent the oldest stone tools ever discovered, predating the Gona tools by 700,000 years.
The date predates the genus Homo by 500,000 years, suggesting this toolmaking was undertaken by Australopithecus or Kenyanthropus, which was found near Lomekwi 3. Previously, evidence of stone tool use by Australopithecus has been suggested on the basis of marks on animal bones, but those findings have been hotly debated, with no scientific consensus forming on either side of the debate. Harmon said that the Lomekwi 3 artifacts do not fit into the Oldowan toolmaking tradition and should be considered part of a distinct tradition, which she termed the Lomekwian. It has been hypothesized that toolmaking may have aided in the evolution of Homo into a distinct genus. However, it is unclear whether the Lomekwian tools are related to those made by Homo species. It is possible the technology was forgotten and later rediscovered. Independent researchers who have seen the tools are generally supportive of Harmon's conclusions. George Washington University's anthropologist Alison Brooks said the tools, quote, could not have been created by natural forces, end quote. The dating evidence is fairly solid. Rick Potts, head of the Human Origins Program at the Smithsonian Institution, said the tools represented a more primitive style than known human-made tools, but something more sophisticated than what modern chimpanzees do. Open quote, there's no doubt it's purposeful toolmaking, end quote, he remarked. Paleoanthropologist Zerezne Alamzeged, I totally butchered that name, and I apologize if you listen, who is responsible for the earlier research suggesting Australopithecus had made tools, also backed Harmon's conclusions. So with that, we are talking about the Lomekwian tool tradition, and we will be right back with Lana and Ella's thoughts and background on what they believe Lomekwian could possibly be in terms of the evolution of our species.
Welcome back to segment 2 of episode 41 of a Life in Ruins podcast. If you made it through our long-winded rambling last time, I'm so proud of you. We are here with Lana Ruck and Ella Beaudoin talking about Lomekwi in Africa. And I mean, not that there's one in Australia or South America. There seems to only be one. So
Specifically Kenya.
And specifically Kenya, hence Kenyanthropus. We had a riveting discussion about that in All right. So last week we talked about, or not last week, well, in the Cerutti episode, we talked about like some controversies having to do with like the state at which like these lithic material, like this lithic material was a tool or not with like the Cerutti mastodon. Was it archaeological or was it a geofact as we defined? So in this site, in a similar situation, Ella has seen the tools in question and Lana was at the conference in which this research was dropped. So I'm going to take a step back here. Do you guys want to, talk about that, set the scene?
Yeah. And let's see, Ella, what year did you see the tools? We'll do it chronologically.
That is a great question. I cannot remember what year, but I'm pretty sure it was before they were published.
Ooh, okay, then you go first.
Okay, I'm pretty sure it was before they were published, just because I remember coming to the museum in the National Museums of Kenya after the field season. I think I was still an intern at the Kubi Fort Field School, which if you want to learn more about, listen to my first podcast episode where I talk about the Kubi Fort Field School. But I think I was still an intern at that point, not a staff member. And I remember walking in and someone was saying, oh my God, like the oldest stone tools, they're here. Oh, like you should go meet Sonia. You should go meet her, And I remember just that kind of, giddy undergrad feeling of like, oh my God. And I went over and all of them are laid out on these tables that we have in the archaeology department and the National Museums of Kenya. And I have to say, at least, in my humble opinion, they're tools. They are 110% tools. They look really weird because of the passive percussion technique in which they were made, which is not something that I necessarily have experience with. Passive percussion, and please jump in to help clarify if I don't explain it super well, is when you basically take a big rock and you smash it on an anvil to break off a flake instead of, say, holding the cobble in your own hand and hitting it with a hammer stone, right? You're using your body weight to flake it almost in the opposite direction as you would if you were hitting it with your hand. So it's a very different kind of fracture pattern that occurs on the rock than what we're traditionally used to, say, in Beaudoin, which is, before this, the oldest stone tool tradition. The flakes fit together really well. They're clearly defined platforms. The one that blew my mind was one of the anvils that had like a perfect hammerstone, like crushing marks in the center. And I just remember I wouldn't necessarily have looked at those on the ground and thought, oh my gosh, those are tools. But once you look at them and you see how they fit back together, it makes a lot of sense. And I think I made a joke. Oh, I've seen these before. And the French man who was writing something down, next to Sonia got very angry at me, and Sonia calmed him down and was like, it's a joke, don't worry. So yeah, that's my experience with the tools. I think they're super interesting and wildly different than anything I've ever seen. That's my monologue. Sorry about that.
No, yeah. I think that was a fantastic description of passive or, anvil based tool making as opposed to doing it with your hands freehand with a hammerstone. And one thing that I do want to talk about at some point in this episode is one of the bonobos that my advisors trained to flint knap. They tried to train him this is Kanzi, and they tried to train him to do Beaudoin style napping where you hold your core in one hand and your hammerstone in the other hand, and you're doing the work with the hammerstone. And immediately Kanzi would just get frustrated and he would just slam the cobbles on the floor, which was a tile floor.
Seriously?
And that's, that's passive percussion. You're just throwing it on a hard surface. And he got flakes like that successfully.
Oh my God. I need measurements of those right now.
Oh, yeah, this was decades ago. Yeah, I think it would be a fantastic comparison to do.
Incredible.
Yeah, so this is way before the Lomekwi was discovered, and they were trying to teach him Beaudoin style napping, so they were trying to not allow him to do this passive technique. And so what they did is they put those little foams that touch together that we all played with as little foam mats, they have puzzle piece edges that you stick together. Uh-huh. They put that all over the floor in Kanzi's, the enclosure that he did his napping in. And he was absolutely furious. He was super mad that they outsmarted him, outsmarting them. And then at nighttime, he would peel back the foam and throw the rocks on the ground again. He was very persistent about this passive technique.
No, okay.
So it's super fascinating. I think it's a missed opportunity that they haven't done that study yet. But for all I know, maybe they haven't. They just haven't published a comparison. But yeah, I've seen casts of the tools, and you're totally right that it's very clear that they're tools, although their size and some aspects of the way that they look, they don't have as obvious of a bulb of percussion, for instance, but everything else about them is it's very clear that they're tools.
I just wanted to clarify that the Lomekwi tools are the size of, I'm a 5'5" woman. So I'm trying to think of how wide they are. They're big. A flake is the size of my hand. Yeah. So I just want to clarify that, which is much bigger. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good. It's a flake is the size of a Nintendo Switch.
That is that's much bigger because they cannot see my hand. And that's a much better comparison.
They're huge. Well, and really interestingly as well is that when they were teaching Kanzi and Panbonisha to nap, all the time they would go for the bigger cores because they were easier for them to manipulate. Okay. But
because their hands have different morphology.
Yeah, they're totally different. Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to ask you, because I noted the material type in the article, and some of it is phonolite, and we have phonolite at Olduvai, and it's beautiful material. It's really pretty. It's really soft. It's almost like the closest you're going to get to chert at Olduvai, whereas the only other stuff we have is basalt and even shittier quartz. We don't have good materials at Olduvai, but the phonolite is really nice. Is that what the phonolite's at Akubifora or in the Turkana region?
I'm trying to remember. I think we have a huge range. Do you guys have ignimbrite? Is that a phonolite?
Ignimbrite is basalt adjacent.
It's that kind of green gray.
Yeah, phonolite is that greenish gray.
Yeah. The greenish gray with the inclusions that kind of sparkle a little bit.
Yeah, they're little black specks.
Yes. Okay. So I've always learned that was ignimbrite, which is probably a kind of faunalite, and there's a lot of really beautiful ignimbrite, faunalite that is available, but also there is really shitty ones as well. So it's a huge spectrum, but we do have it available. But the basalt in Cubi4 is pretty good, I would say.
Okay, because I was wondering, I always think, because I've only seen the casts, and I always wonder if some of that like blockiness that you see in the fractures on those tools, like it's almost like they've been 3D printed and the 3D printer is like glitching. Every few centimeters, there's like a big hop, right?
Yeah.
And in your notes, you called it's almost like fractal. And that has to be due to the material type, which is why I wanted to ask about it.
Like, I think on that point is a great example too. Like the thing about these tools is, so like with an ordinary flake that you might get off of an Oldowan tool, right? You have an Oldowan core and you have an Oldowan flake. Well, it's just a core and a flake. It's not specifically Oldowan. But you have this beautiful smooth surface on the ventral side, or like the side that is connected to the core, right? It's generally smooth because that's where your energy went through the rock from the hammerstone, splitting those, granules apart in this kind of wonderful shape that is super indicative to archaeologists of it being a man-made, human-made, anthropogenic tool. These are weird. Like the ventral surface, yeah, exactly like you said. It's
like chunky.
It's chunky. Yeah.
And you can see it in the images. Yeah. For people who are listening, if you go and look at the figures in the Nature paper that came out in 2015 or in any of the subsequent papers, it's like these are not like tiny little jumps in the surface. They're like pretty visible. I do wish that they had published 3D scans of them. And I do think actually, that's a lie. There are 3D scans of them on africanfossils.org as well that you could look up and kind of rotate.
Because I feel like that's, I think, why, especially to be honest, like I wouldn't have necessarily picked these up at all, because they remind me a lot of, while the shape is not a heat fracture, but the internal structure of how they've pulled away from each other reminds me of heat fractures I've seen on the surface out at Cubi4.
Yeah.
Yeah, for like those who don't know, is sometimes Cubi4 is a desert. It's incredibly hot there. Sometimes rocks on the surface, bits of them will like pop off of each other because of the intense heat. So they fit back together like you would expect a flake, but they don't have a platform. They don't have a bulb of percussion. They don't have any of that, but they have this kind of fitting back together. But it reminds me of like that surface, but with all the other characteristics of a flake, which confuse me.
Yeah. And I do like your point that and this is kind of one of the points of the paper as well, is that the Lomekwi does, regardless of how old it is or the context there, it does, to me, as somebody who studies flint knapping, it deserves its own term and like techno-complex. Like, for sure. It deserves to be called something different than the Oldowan or anything after that, because the morphology is so different and it's quite unique.
Truly.
And the size, yeah.
And the size, yeah. How was it being in like the room when these got announced?
Yeah, so that was my first big conference that I had been to. It was like a combo Paleos SAAs, and it was in San Francisco. And I was just, in the room as a little plebe, It was my first Paleos that I had ever been to. And she gets up on the stage, and I had already noticed the room was just like absolutely packed. This is kind of weird, because it wasn't packed before or after. The way the Paleos runs, you just sit in the same room all day. It's just one session, one talk after the other. They don't have concurrent sessions going. And so it was weird that the room filled up just for that talk. And I don't know what she was originally supposed to talk about. I should have gone and looked up the abstract. But she gets up on stage and she's just like, so I was supposed to talk about something else today, but we just got news this morning that a paper that we put for Nature got accepted and it's going to be published in a few weeks. So I'm going to talk about that instead.
Right.
And then I just hear cameras going off, just like DSLR, like the little shutter speed. And I look to the back of the room, and the whole back of the room is just like lined with journalists, like members of the press. And I was like, what in the ever living? What am I about to see? Yeah, and then she delivered, a very professional talk. It was just straight to the facts. Like the image she showed, the very first image of the talk, was what ended up being that Nature cover with the core and the refit. And she gave her talk super dry. I'm sure she asked for questions, but I don't remember anything dramatic happening about it at all. And she was just like, if you want to see, we have casts of the tools. We're going to have them at our poster. And then she pointed to the poster to get people to go and see it. And then the poster that it was a graduate student on their team who was lead author of the poster, but her and her partner and the one who co-authors with her were there at the table too. Their poster was right across from my poster. So I ended up just getting a lot of traffic to my poster because people were like trying to be nice to the people around the Lomekwi table, you know? And it was fantastic. It was really amazing. And I was just like, all right. I don't know about that. It was all right. I'll always quote Matthew McConaughey as a fellow Texan. But it was just being a graduate student and I'm going to punch sound effect man in the face. It was crazy to see. And I was like, I love this field. I want to be in this field. What I saw today was amazing. I want to do that someday. And it was really cool.
I really vibe with that.
Yeah, that's super awesome. And so like, I think you guys really nailed explaining, kind of the stone tools and the technology and possibly this being its own kind of stone tool tradition. But it seems like you guys both seem to agree that those are tools and those are, hominin created. But the real controversy about this is the dating. So, I mean, would one of you, whoever feels more comfortable talking about this, kind of explain how they dated it and possibly some issues and just kind of, if you can contextualize that within other stone tool traditions, like compare it to Beaudoin and whatnot?
Yeah. You know what? I think I'm not great at dating. That's not, in life and in science. And so I would love if Lana, like if you would jump in, if you understand more things. So the reality, like these stone tools and why we're talking about it and why they're such a big deal is because they're dated to be 3.3 million years old. I know that we kind of briefly talked about that in the intro, but this is about 700,000 years before what was used to be the oldest. So that it's an insane amount of time kind of leaping backwards. Does that, that makes sense? I don't know if I worded that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great. That's a great, yeah.
And I feel like so much of this discovery would be more digestible for like the points that Lana and I have said, that they look like tools, even if it was like 100,000 years earlier, right? Like, I feel like it would be more digestible for the scientific audience, but the fact that it's 700,000 years like older, it's
right. It's just way out of left field. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because there is nothing, Lomekwi, nothing, Beaudoin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The thing about Beaudoin as well is that or one of the, my favorite things about Cubifora is they're everywhere. You cannot kick your foot for hitting a stone tool somewhere. Like humans or like early hominins are so unbelievably prolific when it comes to stone tool manufacture or the byproducts of stone tool manufacture. It's everywhere. So the fact that these are the only kind of tools also is it's a little, as the TikTok teens would say, sus.
So speaking of sus, like, weren't you saying earlier that they had to take that thing away from Kanzi because he would just slam it on the ground?
I'm so interested in this.
Yeah, they had to stop Kanzi from cheating at the task that they wanted him to do, which was freehand Beaudoin style napping. And, if you work with apes, you realize that they're going to cheat your system sooner than you're going to figure out a fix for it. But eventually they did get Kanzi to do freehand napping. But exactly. Like Kanzi can passively nap cores in the exact same way that the Lomekwi hominins were doing.
And we can see that also in other primate species like capuchins. Yeah. There was a recent article that came out. I haven't reread it, so I don't know if this is fully accurate, but capuchins have been shown to passive percuss big, large cobbles, I think almost twice their body weight, because they're accessing, was it salt resources? They were just breaking them in half so they could lick the salt, I think.
Yeah, something about silkcrete. Which is like when it's an eating disorder in humans and it's called pica, where you want to eat minerals, but there might be some nutritional benefit to it, which is cool.
So on that note, we gotta finish out this segment because some things here are a little sus.
Oh my God.
All right. On that note, we are going to end this segment real quick, and then we're going to get back to these awesome stories that we keep telling and keep chatting with you guys. So we'll catch you in the third segment.
Welcome back to episode 41 of the Life in Roots podcast. We are here with Ella Beaudoin and Lana Ruck, and we are talking about Lomekwi. So for the start of this segment, I really wanted to start this off by asking Lana about some of these other issues surrounding the Lomekwian tools. So both Ella and Lana have given their thumbs of approval that the tools are legit. However, there's some other circumstances surrounding these tools that might make the dating or the context of the tools kind of questionable. So, Lana, why don't you start us off by talking about these paleomagnetic
dates? Yes.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us about those?
Okay. So yeah, in East Africa, there are a bunch of different dating techniques that are used. And most frequently you date like volcanic ash sediments that happen from a volcano erupts, a bunch of ash spews into the air. You can date it using stable isotopes. A different method, which is what they used in this paper, combined with prior knowledge about these volcanic ash dates, is paleomagnetism, which is basically where for the last several million years, the Earth's pole has shifted to where magnetic north sometimes is actually the south pole of the planet. And when we're in a normal period like now, the magnetic north is actually the North Pole. But this reverses and it's at like irregular intervals. And we have a good record by like looking at the orientation of things like iron and magnetic molecules in sediments, whether they're pointed basically towards the North Pole as magnetic north or pointed towards the South Pole as magnetic north, which is a reversal. And so paleomagnetism is used a lot in East Africa because during the time of human evolution, there are a lot of these reversal events where the magnetism of the Earth shifted and was reversed. And so something about this paper is that, and it's true of East Africa in general, is that you usually have to date a site by using this conglomeration of dates that you have from known nearby sites. You're never going to be able to excavate a full column because in order to do dating, you have to excavate into the dirt. You can't just use like surface dirt because it could be contaminated. You have to drill it with an actual saw, and these sediments are like concrete hard, so it's really difficult to get these dates, and it's a lot of effort to do dating. So what we usually do is we compare the sediments in their characteristics on the outcrop that we're interested in, right? You're at your site that you're interested in, and then you go find sediments elsewhere along your whole site, like study area. Like they used sites that were 1 kilometer away and half a kilometer away where you already have dates. And you say like the dates that we know from half a kilometer away and another date that we have from a kilometer away, we know that they are below where our excavation is. And we know that other dates we know are above our excavation. We know that date. And they came in and they brought paleomag in because during the date sequence they were looking at, there was a known reversal. So they wanted to see if it was normal or if it was reversed. And it ended up being reversed, which means that their site was in the older part of that sequence. And it's fairly complicated, which is why Ella and I have already talked about. It's kind of hard to do work in Eastern Africa without a background in geology because a lot of it ends up being about geology. And so they were able to date the site to 3.3 million years using these contexts of well-known volcanic sediment dates that they had had from prior work and the addition of paleomagnetism dates, which they collected at the site. And the additional thing that they did was environmental reconstruction to show that it was a woodland. The types of sediment that the things were in, they were embedded in a bunch of silt. And silt really only happens in a lake bed. And they were specifically in these channels of like sandy, we call them channels at Olduvai, other people call them lenses, but they were in these sandy, gravelly little segments of that clay, which indicates that the lake existed prior to the deposition of the site. Then the lake would have receded and gotten smaller, and it was this like kind of braided stream system and floodplain of a lake at the time of deposition of the stone tools, and then the lake got bigger again and came back and buried those tools and kept them preserved for what they argue is 3.3 billion years. So was that a decent enough explanation?
That was a great explanation. It helped me learn a lot.
Okay.
No, I think that was great, and especially because and we talk about this term a lot in archaeology, is that it's relative dating, right? It's not direct dating.
Well, in some other cases you date the materials themselves, but in this case you date the sediment beneath, you date the sediment above, and then you have like 2 layers of sandwich bread. And you're trying to figure out how old your meat is in between those 2 sandwich breads. And when your sandwich breads, like for their instance, their lower date was 3.3 and their higher date was 2.5. And that's a huge range. And when you're trying to prove that something's really old, you want to pull in an additional technique that can either help you say you're closer to the top slice of the sandwich bread or you're closer to the bottom slice of the sandwich bread. And paleomagnetism can do that for you as long as you sample a reversal. If you sample the whole column and the whole sequence is always either regular or always either reversed, then you can't slice your sandwich breads across from each other. They're still in the same, they're still in the same context. So paleomag is really used when they're trying to take a big chunk of time and cut it in half by either being on the reversal side of it or the normal side of it. The other controversial thing, like the dates, cool, fine. The fact that they had to use multiple correlations across stratigraphy, fine.
Because that's used in all of Kupifora.
Yeah, well, and it's used across Olduvai too. It's an Eastern African technique, and it's super amazing.
Yeah, it's just you also want to do, I think what I meant more too is just the fact that it's not weird that they did multiple dating techniques. That's not weird.
Absolutely not.
That's super normal, especially when we're working with materials that are this old. I think on your point though, right, is you're trying to figure out where in this sandwich bread, is it closer to the bottom? Is it closer to the top? Mm-hmm. The meat is sandwiched in the middle of these 2 timelines. But I think the issue with Lomekwi are the stone tools that have been found there, are they actually from in between these 2 pieces of sandwich bread, or are they from a much younger sediment that then got washed in, got pushed in? And that's, I think, this article's and maybe the biggest debate with this particular discovery.
Yeah.
I just want to mention a couple of other things to put this in context as well. So Dakika is another site that is an incredibly important site in terms of understanding our human evolution, but it's also a very controversial site. And this is the site of the oldest cut mark ever found on a bone. What that shows is that hominins were there, were accessing meat resources, were using stone tools to cut up carcasses, etc. Now, the problem with that site is that there were no other stone tools at that age range found near the actual cut marked bone. And then there's also a lot of debate as to whether it actually is a cut mark or whether it's abrasion from surface material or whether it's trampling. And I think that Lomekwi and Dakika are very much linked in that Lomekwi states there must have been stone tools prior to Dakika to have that happen, right? Yeah. So it just feels very tenuous, all of these kind of connections that are being made. But the thing about Lomekwi is that they have a total of 149 artifacts found. And if you go through it, they kind of state which ones were found in situ. And in situ traditionally means laid down, like you said, it was laid down by the thing that created them, covered and not disturbed again. And they have been like that for since they were created. That's kind of in situ. And that's so important in archaeology for so many reasons, because it gives us understanding of not only the times and dates, but also the relationship of tools to each other, that we can understand potential other things about behavior. But they only have about 18 from the original paper. They say they only have 18 actually in situ artifacts. They do state that one of the in situ pieces matches a flaked piece perfectly that was down the slope. So they kind of say, well, if we found one piece in situ and we found the flake a little bit down the slope for that piece, it must have just recently been eroded out. So it can't have moved that far. But then if you kind of go through and read other papers that are in rebuttal to this original Nature paper. For example, Archer et al. 2020, which is a very funny paper because they have gone through a time-lapsed video of excavations at the Lomekwi site and paused it at like day 1, day 2, day 3, and like circled all of the artifacts they think are on the surface that people are saying are in situ. They're basically saying that the original paper, the Nature paper that first put all of this out, is taking a very liberal definition of what in situ means. I kind of agree. I think when looking at I'm very confused about all of it.
Yeah, you cannot argue with the images in that 2020 recent paper. And I'm not sure what journal it's in. Is it Journal of Human Evolution, maybe? And it's called What is in Situ?
That is correct. Yeah.
Well, and it's like, I feel for both sides here because, so for instance, the site that I've been working at pre-pandemic, most recently at Olduvai, it looks almost exactly like this site. It's a hill slope where we found it because a giant elephant bone was eroding out of the surface. And you collect that, you collect everything else on the surface, and then you dig back into the hillside. And you're kind of stuck in between a really difficult situation because the further back you dig, the more likely you are to find things that associate with that layer that you originally discovered on the surface, right? But the further back you go, that means you have to remove more overburden to get to that level because the whole slope is like upward, right? So at the front of the hill, you only have a few centimeters to excavate. And part of this 2020 paper is like things that are 1 or 2 centimeters below the surface are not in situ. That is colluvium, is what we call it at Olduvai. That's overburden and that's slope wash, right? But once you get further and further back into the hill, you're not in that scary situation where you're 1 or 2 centimeters below the surface. You're now a foot, as Americans would say. And the further you dig back, now you're a meter underneath the surface, but you're still at the same layer and you're still digging up what you think are associated tools to that erosional surface coming out of the hill. And I guess I should have prefaced this all by saying this is really clear when you look at the pictures and you look at that day by day and you see day 1, it's an outcrop surface. It's a hill slope. Day 2, they've dug a little bit into it. Day 3, they've dug a little bit into it. Year 2, they've dug 14 square meters into it. And they want to keep digging more and more back into that layer to see if they can find a bigger sample. But labor-wise, you're digging through concrete and you have to remove multiple meters of sterile concrete in order to get to your level that you want to be at. And so we've been working at the site that's kind of similar to this. It's nowhere near it in date, so it's not that super important. But the kind of context, I kind of feel their pain of wanting to associate these high sample number of like finds that are arguably not the strict sense of in situ with what is further back in the hill, because especially with the refit, I can see how they were like, all right, this is good enough to say that these things are associated. But it's a very tough debate. I don't think there's a very clear answer.
Yeah. And while I agree with you, right, that of course, like I also feel for them because, I've dug through sediment like that. Yeah, you were exact. Concrete is such a great example, and the blisters you get on your hands and et cetera. But with something this old and also with something this potentially important, what's frustrating to me is if you, like Archer et al. Said, they went back through all those photos and they kind of identified that probably instead of the 18 in situ artifacts, if you took out all of the ones that were stretching the term in situ, they only have 3, which for me, they only really have 3 in situ artifacts. And that is incredibly problematic, especially because so much of what we know from this time period is very much based on sample size, and especially from Kubifora. So Kubifora has a really big deflation issue. And so like what deflation means basically is that multiple time periods get all compressed together onto one landscape. So you could have things like I have, you can walk around camp and I can see a obsidian shard next to an Oldowan cobble. Those two things are crazy different time periods, but they've deflated onto the surface. So for much of Kubifora, a lot of the collections that we're getting are several thousand years of materials together, I feel.
Yeah. I mean, same thing is true at Olduvai. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like when we're in a region where that happens so often, to only have, I feel like you have to be strict about in situ.
Yeah.
And if you're not, the reality is only 3 is not, how, I think we talked about this briefly before, in our like pre-podcast meeting. What does this then, if we say, okay, they're tools, the dating is fine, but there are only 3 artifacts. If we cut it all the way down to that, how much do those 3 artifacts tell us anything about anything?
Right.
And does 3 stone artifacts, does that make a whole new stone tool tradition that we're going to, completely change and rewrite human history about?
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that's what's so frustrating too about paleo, at least on like my advisor, my mentor in paleo is very much, and I'm a little biased since he has actually, I think I added one of the papers in, has found the oldest Beaudoin tools now. So that's also something I want to talk about for sure, especially the fact that the oldest Beaudoin now that have been found in Ethiopia look nothing like Lomekwi. So the argument that they are an intermediate stage between nothing and Beaudoin is a little bit iffy for me. So I'm a little biased in this, but he always taught me that the only way in paleo to really do anything is by enormous sample sizes, because we don't have writing. We don't have, personal accounts. We have nothing else data wise except for what we can collect and the measurements we can take. And I feel as though, if someone presented a site paper, like if they're saying, we discovered a new site, look at how amazing it is, and it was Beaudoin or it was a Schulian, and it only had 3 artifacts, that wouldn't get published.
Right. Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Larger samples drive confidence in interpretation. And I will, one thing that is really interesting about these Lomekwi papers is that the original one came out in 2015, the next one in 2016. Nothing has come out since. And and maybe they're working on something. Maybe they've dug, meters deep through concrete back in to find bigger samples. We don't know yet. But some of the interpretations, particularly in that second paper, the 2016 one, which I think is in Philosophical Transactions Biology or whatever, which is a huge high-profile journal, they're talking about things like brain evolution in that paper. And, what species could it be attributed to? And really making these really, really, really big ideas off of what they think is 20 in situ tools, what other people have shown, frame by frame with videos, to be actually not that many in situ artifacts at all. And they're making pretty bold claims about the evolutionary narrative when there's so many other equally plausible things. And when we recorded my episode way back when, the thing that I said, when I teach Lomekwi, I teach the significance of this is that it exists. People are looking for more examples of it. If they don't find them, there's nothing more than a clever human ancestor figured out how to break rocks. We don't know what they used them for, but that invention didn't percolate across the society that they were embedded in, as far as we know. Mm-hmm. It was a one-off innovation that never caught on, and you can't tell an evolutionary story off of that. You really can't.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
And then I promise I'll stop. Okay. This is my hot take Wednesday. I think we haven't touched upon it not being a human ancestor, that it's some other primate that has created these things. Since you've said that Kanzi was doing that passive percussion. You've seen Capuchins do passive percussion.
Yeah.
And I remember when Sonia came and talked at work, Rick Potts stood up and asked a question, how he said that he'd seen baboons will sometimes just pick up little rocks and hit them together because they like the noise not, for no other reason than that. So
Yeah.
I feel like there's the really, really cool thing about, which I think is way cooler than the possibility of it being a one-off human ancestor, is like this is evidence of other non-human, primates, early primates doing interesting things in interacting with their environment, especially when we don't have any sort of the traditional things that we would associate with primate tool use, doesn't preserve sticks, etc.
Absolutely.
Like, I think these are so cool, especially if potentially they were from other primates. Like, oh, so cool. Okay. That would be my favorite. I hope it's a little baboon banging these things together.
I think that's just as plausible as all the other theories. Like, that is as scientifically sound. It's
Exactly.
likely.
All we know is that it wasn't aliens.
Yeah, all we know is that it wasn't aliens. That's for freaking sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it wasn't aliens. That has been episode 41 of A Life in Ruins podcast. Ella and Lana, thank you guys so much for coming on our show today. We really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating topic. I mean, you guys were off leash the entire time, just totally taking over this podcast. It was absolutely fascinating. Ella, could you please drop your handles so our listeners can get a hold of you?
Yeah, so my Twitter is at Ella_Beaudoin, and my Instagram is at Simple Homo Sapien. And there you'll find a link tree to link to my other podcast with you guys and some science communication writing I have done, as well as Smithsonian webinars that you can all watch.
Excellent. And what about you, Ms. Ruck? How can our listeners follow you or get a hold of your research?
You can also find dank memes on Ella's social media. She forgot to mention that. It's important.
Oh, my dank memes.
Oh, yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Lana Ruck, and I'm on Instagram, but not super active and not super sciencey. But you can watch me post pictures of me and Carlton hiking at Lana Lately on Instagram.
Excellent. And with that, we are out. Thanks for listening to A Life in Ruins podcast.
You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at A Life in Ruins podcast, and you can also email us at alifeinruinspodcast@gmail.com.
And remember, make sure to bring your archaeologists in from the cold and feed them beer. All right, so listeners, this isn't from my father. This is from the internet. Yeah, I have a good joke about stone tools, but it's a bit of an older one.
I actually love that one.
Bruh. Yeah,
that one I like.
Bruh. Okay.
That one's great.
Good job.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.